At the end of the day, when we only have ourselves to face in the mirror, how do we justify our beliefs? When we claim to know something, what ultimately grounds that knowledge? What marks the line that separates ignorance and insight? And how do we make sense of the mechanisms that make knowledge possible in the first place? These questions, when taken seriously, inevitably lead us towards the Münchhausen Trilemma, a term coined by philosopher Hans Albert to describe our epistemological situation. The trilemma is so called because it outlines three options and suggests that these are indeed our only options. Each horn of the trilemma is unsatisfactory in its own way. The question then becomes, which variety of unsatisfactory account do you prefer, and how do you attempt to explain away the problematic implications of your chosen conceptual scheme? The problem in question gets its name from a story about Baron Münchhausen, who, along with his horse, gets stuck in a mire. Remarkably, as the story goes, he escapes by pulling himself and his horse up out of the mire by his own hair. Obviously, this would be impossible, because without something against which to set oneself to acquire leverage, the act of pulling is inconceivable. The story illustrates the problem with trying to ground knowledge in a kind of bootstrapping process. No matter which of the three options one selects, a similar sort of pulling up by your own hair issue presents itself. Knowledge, it seems, must rest on some kind of primitive epistemic concept which is not itself validated, since it is itself the means of validation. The first of the three horns is circular reasoning, where a claim is justified by appealing to something that ultimately depends on or implicitly assumes that same claim. This leads to a logical loop with no real foundation, like saying, I trust logic because logic is trustworthy. The second horn is known as infinite regression, where every justification requires further justification, leading to an endless chain that never reaches a final answer. It's like trying to build a house on quicksand. Knowledge is never secured because security requires a foundation that does not move. The third of our options is the axiomatic or dogmatic approach, where we simply accept certain fundamental principles as given or self-evident. Science, for instance, assumes the uniformity of nature, while morality and art presuppose goodness and beauty. But if these axioms cannot themselves be justified, have we truly arrived at knowledge, or just chosen a convenient stopping point? To put it another way, how do we know that we have chosen the correct axioms? The trilemma appears to trap us in an epistemic quagmire, but does reality itself bow to these constraints, or might they instead reflect limitations of subjectivity? The issues involved in the trilemma may arise not from reality itself, but from how we attempt to structure it. Nature, on the other hand, is neither propositional nor bound by human logic. It simply is. The assumption that knowledge of nature must depend on rigid man-made justifications might itself be flawed. One way to potentially escape the trilemma is through the principle of sufficient reason, which states that everything, event, object, entity, or fact, must have an explanation. Unlike infinite regress, which leaves questions ultimately unanswered, or axiomatic approaches which stop arbitrarily, the PSR demands that reality be structured in such a way that its explanation is necessary rather than assumed. This avoids both vicious circularity and an endless regression of justification. A key mistake often made when engaging with the trilemma is treating explanatory principles the same way as empirical facts. While facts do not, and indeed cannot, explain themselves, an explanatory framework, on the other hand, must be self-justifying. Vicious circularity, where a fact is purportedly explained by itself, is problematic. But virtuous circularity, where an ontology or explanatory system justifies itself by appealing to the necessity of its basic principles or concepts, may be the only way forward. Consequently, rather than exposing an inescapable problem, the trilemma may in fact reveal the limitations of how we frame, discuss, and engage in the practice of justification. If reality is necessarily the way it is, the need for arbitrary axioms or infinite regressions dissolves. The real question isn't whether justification can be complete, but whether we are even asking the right questions in the first place. So, what do you think? What is the question which we should be asking? And what do you think is the answer?